Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World, the extraordinary true story of Shackleton and the Endurance. Chapter 12, Escape from the Ice. Thousands of birds accompanied the three boats as the crew got underway. Fulmars, terns, snow petrels, and Cape pigeons filled the sky. The men, leaning to the oars, were pelted with bird droppings as they tried to accustom themselves to the new circumstances. The sides of all of the boats had been raised for protection against rough seas, but that made the seats too low for rowing. The men had to sit awkwardly on crates and packing cases in order to dig their oars into the water at a proper angle. Long out of patience, the rowers fumbled and cursed as they tried to find a rhythm. The wind was bitter, but it was impossible to row fast enough to keep warm. The danger of ramming into large chunks of brash ice surrounded them. It was too great. The swell crashing on the windward side of the great blue tabular icebergs threw spray 60 feet into the air and down onto the boats, where it froze on the men. Those who weren't rowing ducked their heads down against the spray and bird droppings and kept a wary eye out for killer whales. In the lead was James Caird, the largest boat, with Shackleton, Wild, and 10 of the men. McElroy, Wordy, Hussey, James, Clark, Hurley, McCarthy, Green, McNeish, and Vincent. Behind them was the Dudley Docker, steered by Worsley, and manned by another 8. Greenstreet, Cheatham, Kerr, Macklin, Marston, Ordlees, McLeod, and Holness. Bringing up the rear was the Stancomb Willis, with Crean and Hudson in command and the remaining 5 men. Rickson, Howe, Bakewell, Stevenson, Blackborough the stowaway, who had good reason to regret his decision to sneak aboard Endurance. The going was slow as they picked a gingerly course through the ice, but they were making progress. Within an hour, they had pulled at least a half a mile away from Patience Camp, which was now lost forever in the broken pack behind them. The men began to think they were truly on their way at last, when a strange rumbling noise reached their ears. At first, they could see nothing, and then from the east-southeast came a thick flow of ice on a riptide current, like a wide river of tumbling, churning chunks and flows. It was barreling straight toward them at a rate of 3 miles an hour. With the shout to the other boats, Shackleton brought the Caird around, and the men began to row as hard as they could. The riptide was roaring after them, threatening to engulf the 3 puny boats with a deluge of ice and slush. The men who were not rowing stamped their feet in time to help the rowers keep a steady rhythm with the oars. Twice the Docker was almost caught, but each time she pulled clear. For 15 minutes, the 3 boats fled from the flood of ice, and then, just as suddenly as it happened, it faded away, and the water grew calm again. The exhausted rowers collapsed over the oars and were pulled aside by the other men, who took their places. Bobbing blue ice and crumbling floes rose and fell with the waves all around them as they brought the boats back onto course for the northwest. They continued pulling all afternoon, still dodging through open leads and around large floes and bergs. As the light began to fade, Shackleton began looking out for a good, strong floe to camp on. Eventually, one was spotted, and the men were happy to see it was inhabited by a large crab-eater seal. By 6:30, all hands were pitching tents, and Green was firing up the blubber stove to make dinner out of the seal. By 8 o'clock, everyone except the watch was fast asleep, with the sound of waves slapping and splashing against the edge of their camp. But then, an intangible feeling of uneasiness made me leave my tent around 11 p.m., Shackleton wrote. The heavy swell had changed and was now crashing into their floe head-on. I had started to walk across the floe to warn the watchman to look carefully for cracks when the floe lifted on the crest of a swell and cracked under my feet as I was passing the men's tent. The men were in one of the dome-shaped tents, and it began to stretch apart as the ice opened. I rushed forward, helped some men to come out from under the canvas. The crack had widened to about 4 feet, and I saw a whitish object floating in the water. "Somebody's missing!" one of the men yelled as the tent's occupants scrambled to safety in the darkness. The whitish object in the water was a sleeping bag of earnest wholeness inside it. The boss leaned over and grabbed the sodden bag and heaved it and wholeness out of the freezing water and onto the ice, just as the two edges of the floe crashed back together. Then the crack opened once more, separating the camp. Wholeness's mates began walking him up and down to warm him because there were no dry clothes into which he could change. Ice crackled off his clothes and fell tinkling onto the floe as the rest of the crew drew the two halves of the floe together again by hauling on a rope. After sledding the James Caird across the larger piece of floe, the men jumped to safety with the rest of the crew. Shackleton remained behind to ensure that all of his men got over safely, and the floes began to separate again. Shackleton hauled on his end of the rope, and one man's strength was not equal to the force of the pulling ocean the floes apart. As his crew watched in horror, he drifted out of sight into the darkness. "Launch a boat!" he called. Just as Wild gave the same order, the Stancomb Willis was shoved into the water to rescue him. As Worsley commented, the few minutes it took to fetch Shackleton were among the most anxious I have ever known. Once the entire crew was reassembled, it was time to turn their attention to Wholeness, who was in serious danger of freezing to death. Green fired up the blubber stove in order to get some hot milk into the sailor. "You're all right, Wholeness," Shackleton. "You all right, Wholeness?" Shackleton asked him. "Yes, boss," the man chattered, shivering uncontrollably. "Only thing I'm thinking is about my tobacco I left in the bag." The men dared not return to their tents. Instead, they sought the warmth of the fire for the rest of the night. Crowded around the little stove with its smoky, flickering blubber flames, we looked like hobgoblins. Macklin wrote. Every 2 hours until morning, the cook served another round of seal steaks to keep up the men's strength. In the darkness at the edge of the floe, killer whales spouted gustily. In spite of our troubles and losing sleep, the whole party was in good spirits, for at last we had exchanged inaction for action, Worsley remembered. We had been waiting and drifting at the mercy of the pack ice. There had been nothing that we could do to escape. Now there were more dangers and hardships, but we were working and struggling to save ourselves. We were full of hope and optimism, feelings that Shackleton always fostered. By 5 a.m., the first hint of daylight glowed dimly in the east, and daybreak brought a chilly, misty, overcast day, with snow squalls driving in ragged veils across the ice. The men were more than ready to leave the unlucky floe behind, and once the boats were launched, they continued rowing through the pack with the cold easterly wind at their cheeks, trying to make their way north as much as the crowding ice allowed. The weather made it impossible to get a sun sight, but Worsley's best guess put Clarence and Elephant Isles about 30 or 40 miles north. Throughout the morning, they continued to row toward these small landfalls, and then at about 11 o'clock, they suddenly broke free of the pack and found themselves in open ocean. Amid much rejoicing, the crews of the 3 small boats raised sail and forged ahead, spray breaking over their bows and freezing all of the men and all of the contents on the boats. The rejoicing was short-lived. We rounded the north end of the pack, Worsley explained, but found that in the open the sea was too heavy for our deeply laden boats. Besides the weight of 28 men, we had 3 tents, spare clothing, our sleeping bags, Primus lamps and paraffin, oars, mast, sails, and 3 weeks' food for the pantry. We returned to the shelter of the pack, unloaded, and hauled the boats up on the Floberg at 3:30 p.m. There we abandoned 1 week's supply of food. While we pitched the tents and secured the boats, Green raided the abandoned stores. Presently, he produced the best and largest meal we had eaten in 5 months. They had finally escaped from the pack, but the open ocean had proved too much for their small fleet. They were back in the ice.